All right, should I start? I can start, I guess. If people come in, it's fine. All right, so this is really informal. I'm just basically going to go through the code, um, and kind of give you know, just an overview of like what Dagster does, and if you have questions, just stop me. Um, First, I wanted to show how do I just get the Zoom thing to get out of here? Um, no, it's fine. So. Oh yeah. The final thing is that I have this top lines newsletter. I know Lane, you know about it. Maybe Ford. I don't know if you guys all subscribe to it, but the final product is this thing, right? That has like daily stats for NCAA players. Um, so before what I had, this is I had like an airflow project, and basically um, I used to do scraping, but then at some point I switched to the ESPN API. So, it gets data from the API and then updates a Postgres database. And then um, that's pretty much it for the Airflow part of it. And then I have like a separate project that does like all the SQL stuff. And I had like a huge 1,000 line SQL query, which was pretty insane. So I decided to move it over to Dagster. And yeah, it's been a lot better. It's like I don't know if it's in total all faster end to end, but like the part where it does the report used to take like a half an hour, and now it's like 10 seconds or something. So there's some crazy gains. Maybe because of DuckDB, I'm not sure. But all right. So first thing is, so in VS Code, um, you can see is the font okay? Size okay? Do you
Yeah, it's
guys
fine.
are able to see it? Um, can try to make it bigger. Well, maybe I won't. How do you make it bigger, actually? I don't even know. Plus? Oh, there we go. So basically, you set up some Dagster project, similar to how you would do Airflow. And the main components of it, I'm going to collapse these. Um, the main components are assets, which are basically like, they used to call them ops. So I guess Dagster started probably 4 or 5 years ago. I think somewhere around 2020. And initially, it was more like air. Oh, Andrew. Okay, let's get him in here. Hey, Andrew, I just started. Um, so I think initially it was more like airflow based on tasks. The idea being like, each op was like some part of the DAG to do something, and then I guess maybe 2 years ago they switched, or I don't want to say switch, but they kind of have a new abstraction called assets, and functionally they're not so different from ops, but sort of the mental model is that an asset is like a more tangible thing, like a database table or a report. So like instead of an op being like let's say an op is like join two tables, right? Whereas an asset might be like create report or just report. It's more like a noun versus a verb sort of thing. So I've switched. I basically have all my things set up as assets, but I do have some ops for a few things. Like for example, to I have a job that deletes tables, and those are ops because it would be weird to have it as like an asset. So it's sort of like a cleanup job. But basically, the Dagster projects revolve around defining these assets. Um, And then you have jobs, which you can chain together assets. You can run assets on their own, but eventually you're going to want to join a bunch of assets into a job. Partitions are essentially like the way I use a partition is, or a good example is like a daily partition or a weekly partition. So if you have a job, like in my case, like it's going to get games, from the API. I have that set up as a daily partition, And that way, it's sort of like an airflow, like where you can do backfill and things like that. So if you have a partition, it's convenient to do backfills essentially. Resources are things that are going to be used by multiple assets typically. Like, so a resource, an obvious one is like a database resource that's shared between different assets. So I have like DuckDB set up as a resource. You might have like a Snowflake connector as a resource, something like that. And then schedules are pretty self-explanatory. If you have, you have like something like cron jobs or whatever that you're going to do on some kind of schedule. For this project, I'm I'm not even using a schedule right now. I'm just manually. It's like not that hard for me to update things. Um, and and also even like it's running locally, so my laptop might not be open and able to run things all the time. And that's pretty much it. For those are like the main things that every project's going to have. Um, the way it works is that this is so in you'll have an init um, uh, script inside the Dagster folder essentially, and in there it's going to look for this object, this definitions object, and that's essentially what they call a code location. So like a project can have more than one code location, but it's kind of it's almost like a singleton, it seems to me. Like essentially you can have more than one code location, but it's kind of messy and like sharing assets between different projects or code locations seems pretty difficult. And so for the most part, it's easy to think about like a project being this single code location. Um, and for the most part, you can actually write code and it'll as long as the server is running, um, which this one's actually up and running, you won't have to reload the code location. But if you change like certain things like your environment variables or uh, yeah, there's some other instances where you have to like kind of redefine the code location, but that's the main thing. And so in a code location or what they call this definitions, you're essentially just defining the assets. So whatever assets you want to have in your model, the resources. So like I have the database, the jobs, and the schedules. And I'll go through these things that I have here and then yeah, but that it's pretty straightforward. Once you figure out what's going on, it's not that bad. So uh, let's go into assets. So for my assets, I basically have most of my assets revolve around that ESPN API. Um, so you know, here's an asset called the teams file, right? Where I have a duck resource, I have a local file storage resource, and this object called a context um, is a Dagster thing, and like basically like the context is used for logging. There's a logger in there, and it basically the context like knows things about the job. So there's also like you'll see later there's like configuration you can get from the context. Um, the way you define an asset is with the asset decorator. So essentially, there's this asset decorator has all these different arguments, name, uh, configs, things like that. There's even like compute kind is like you can kind of label things like this is a Python asset, and it'll show up with a cute little icon in the UI. Um, you can give a group name. So like I have several assets that are seasonal, like things that have happen once a year, in theory, like getting the teams, getting the conferences, like getting all those things ready for each season. And then I'll have other groups like for report or daily things that are run daily, stuff like that. And then you can basically, if you have groups like that, you can construct jobs by selecting a bunch of assets from a group. So it just makes like job construction easier. Um, the one thing I should say about Dagster that I'm still coming to grips with is that it's super flexible and it's like so flexible and that that's kind of a pain sometimes because there's many ways to do the same thing. So and it's not clear always like what the Dagster way to do things is. Um, but you know, it's the Spider-Man with great responsibility or great power comes great responsibility or whatever. So it's sort of like you just have to figure out the way that you want to do things, especially when you're you know in my job I've had a switch over to Dagster, and you know, if you have a team, it's a little bit trickier, right? Because you're like, you all have to decide like how you're going to do things. So it can be a little tricky, but so anyway, you have this asset decorator, and yeah, for the most part, it's just Python code. Um, from what I remember from Airflow, one of the pain points was like sort of passing data between tasks, like from one piece of code to the other. Dagster actually makes that super easy. Um, so you can by depending on what you're returning, like you can basically just return data, and you can also return metadata. But you can essentially pass data from one asset to another asset. In most of my code, I'm actually creating tables. So you can see here I'm executing. Well, in this case, this is just a file. Getting data from an API and saving it as a file. Um, but I would say it's to me easier than what I remember from Airflow, like sort of going from one asset to another. Um, and I'll show you how things connect. So yeah, in this asset, we're essentially just getting the team's data from the ESPN API. Here we're getting conferences, so you know the definitions of the conferences. Here, so I think we talked about this in Slack the other day. Like here's staging. So this is basically staging the conferences data, and I have a um, some queries here. So you know, creating a table and then all these queries. So nothing, I mean, it's just basic SQL there. One thing to note here is this dependencies. So this argument to the asset is where you're going to specify like the DAG, essentially the DAG properties of from Dagster. So this staging conferences is going to depend on that asset having run. What I've noticed is that um, it's not necessarily a hard dependency. And what I mean by that is like it won't necessarily fail if that asset hasn't run. It'll just kind of tell you that it hasn't run. Um, I think you can try to enforce it. You can do um, different checks. It actually has these really interesting they're called asset checks, and I'll show you that some one of the or I have them in different assets, but essentially you can check for like you know if you create a table that the table sort of like with DBT or something like that there's no null values or that a certain number of records were inserted or things like that, so you can do those kinds of checks. um, I think the dependencies are mostly for Dagster to be able to run things like in the right order and stuff like that, as an orchestrator. So yeah, I'll just go through these, and as I see anything that looks interesting, I'll mention it. So here I'm staging a teams table. Here I'm getting roster files. Let's see, what do I have here? So this is something new. So here's a config schema. So like when I run this asset, I can configure it to have a specific season. And also, yeah, um, I think here I was running this to, there were some exceptions, like some teams in the ESPN API were broken, so they didn't have any data. So I configured it to um, basically specifically with IDs that I wanted to rerun um, if the data was not there. Um, yeah, so you can see some logic there for that. Um, oh, I need to fix this. Okay, this should be called seasonal, but anyway. So here, staging a players table. Oh, and I can actually show you just like what one of these tables looks like. So from, let's say, stage players, limit one. Um, yeah. So, I mean, it's just Duck is, if you haven't used Duck, it's essentially like any other. I guess this is actually a good time to say, like, the nice thing about Duck is that it's just sitting there. Um, there's no server running. It's just like a package that you can install, which is really nice. And it's super fast when you don't have a ton of data. It's persistent in the sense that there's, I think I can actually show you here. So it's just sitting there in like a SQLite database, you know, in there. And so uh, it's I wouldn't put mission critical data on a local file like that, but in this case, even if it gets corrupted or it would get deleted accidentally, I could reproduce everything um, within like an hour or so. So it's not
Did you
such a big deal.
create that that DuckDB instance like at the beginning, or is this essentially a running each week? It stacks rows on, or both?
So what I'm it sort of doesn't matter. Originally, my thought was like, I'm just gonna create a new one like every. I didn't know like how fast it would be or whatever. Like, so the idea was like, well, maybe I'll just delete it and then redo everything. But it's persistent enough where I think like I'm just adding. I think I'm just going to be adding, every day new data to the tables, and since nobody else is using this database, like, it doesn't really matter. If something happens to it for some reason, like I'm not sure what would happen, I would just recreate it. I would just backfill everything, and I'll show you what the backfilling looks like. But so it really depends. Like, I think for Duck, one of the issues is it's not concurrent, and I actually have. Let me see if I can find an example here where that's an issue, or where I have to deal with that. Yeah. So something like this, when there's concurrency issues, when you have multiple assets like that you want to run in parallel or something like that, or not that some you can have multiple assets that are not dependent on each other and you want them to run in parallel. So with Duck, if you're not I think there's the cloud service that does have some concurrency capability, but with the open source like local version, there's no concurrency. So I'm using this fasteners, this locking thing, um, which seems super easy. I mean, you just literally, I just add this line and it seems to like it gets rid of any concurrency issues. Um, but yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think it would depend on your use case, right? Since this is like just a hobby project, like I don't really care about that database. It's not like, I mean, it's just sitting there.
yeah. I
Um,
guess my usage question is, you know, this is what this is like small production, so like internal
yeah.
stuff, so not like full on production,
Yeah.
but like, do I create that .db or do I just keep the parquets as is? I'm trying to figure out if there's a meaningful difference between doing
Oh,
that at all.
oh, you're saying like between having the raw data and doing all the queries on raw data?
Yeah, because we because it's not our thing. Couple things aren't. like
Yeah,
daily like this, and so it becomes a question of is it worth the hassle even to I mean, I'm sure hassle as of right now it is in loose parquets because that's how it's stored in S3. Is it worth us creating that
right.
semi-persistent .db or just scan parquet since it's not like a second or two here and there really matters that much?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's more like um it's almost more for my logical sanity of like because if you look at how many tables and how many different processes, like it's enough. Like I think four of these are or all of these are staging tables. And so I kind of wanted to have a logical separation of my SQL queries. Otherwise I would have like back to what I had before, like 1,000 line SQL query. So most of this, and also like for this project, I don't have to do everything every day. So like my email newsletter, I only send it out like once or twice a week, whereas the games I'm trying to get every day. So I don't want to connect like all the logic for all those things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get it.
Um, so I think it just depends on your use case and like, you know, in our at work or I work from home, so it's here. But in my company, we mostly just do everything um, from S3. We don't have like staging. We don't have staging or anything like that, and we're still using Duck. Um, and we use Duck and Dagster that way. So that helps answer your question too. Okay, so let's see. I don't want to forget anything here. Yeah, going back to the asset check. So here's an example where you add these asset checks to the decorator. And you can see, for example, here, you know, this one has at least one game. All games completed is true. All game IDs have 9 digits, stuff like that. Some of these I just created just to like test the capabilities, but it's pretty cool. If you want to do asset checks, you return a generator, and that way it can yield like the asset checks. And then after an asset check, if it doesn't pass, you can raise an exception, like to quit the job, or you can keep going. So that's you know pretty useful. And then if you want to yield output to the next asset, you can put a use this output class and give it the value that you want to pass. Um, so yeah, let's see. If there's anything else I want to. Oh, okay. And then this one. So as I mentioned, like before with partitions, so this one is stage daily scoreboard, right? So from stage, let's see what's in this one. Oh, yeah. So um, this is one that I want to be able to do backfills and stuff like that. It has like the game info, and essentially to do that, you create a partition, and we can go to the definition. It's super simple. You just, you know, Dagster has this built-in daily partitions, and I get a start date from a environment variable, and that's it. So really easy. And we'll go to the UI, and I'll show you what that looks like in the UI. I think the other thing I wanted to talk about as we get to the bottom here, a couple other interesting things. Okay, this is I guess a pattern. This is a factory pattern. So, and we've been using this at work too. Sometimes you're going to have assets that you want to have a factory because it's like the same asset and you need to make a bunch of them. So this one is like, um, well, actually, this is not even, I think, oh yeah, is this the right one? Yeah, this is the one where we want to build a table. And so I want to be able to do it for, you know, different like freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors. But it's essentially the same asset repeated. And I just, I'm just returning an asset's definition. So inside the function, oh, what the heck? Your free meeting will end in 10 minutes. What the hell? Is that a thing?
Yeah,
How do I get rid?
Zoom, unless you have the pro account, is a 30-minute cap.
Okay. All right. I guess we better hurry. Um, so yeah, this is a factory, and essentially I'm going to return this asset, um, and then I build the assets here. I think I also have another one here. Oh yeah, let's go here. So one thing I'm doing this season is I have a bunch of models, and I'll show you what it looks like in the UI. But essentially, I have adjustment. I'm doing these adjustments, team adjustments for essentially every statistic that goes into my rankings. So for turnovers, free throws, all these things, and they're just regression models. And so you can see here, like each of these is an asset is building an asset, and I have the same thing for shot types also. So for all these, I'm doing adjustments, and so for those, we have a bunch of different. So I think that's I think that's it for assets. Let's go to the UI, and I'll show you what it looks like. So I already said that there's a code location. Um, you could run assets individually. So I have, basically it's like when you create that definitions or the code location object, it registers. It's basically think of it as a registry. So we're registering all those different assets, um, and we could view them in this nice. I think it's Daggett is the name of the package they use to do this, and so it's nicer than air. It's definitely nicer than Airflow from a just like graphic standpoint. So you can see if I expand these, I have just like a metric ton, shit ton of different jobs, um, especially if we get to up for the models. I have like 26 of these models that are going to run. So it's a lot of stuff potentially. Um, And oh, one thing I didn't do is talk about the jobs. So in the jobs are pretty easy. Essentially, you can just create like uh, I think mentioned earlier, like if you have a group like models, we could just assemble those into a job. So I have like updating the models job, the daily update job, and then this top lines job is making a report.
So
And
these are
so
essentially ways to essentially assemble functions into.
exactly.
Yeah, okay, so you could reuse multiple entities or assets across different jobs for whatever you had to
Yeah,
do.
and the cool thing, and this is what we do on my team at work, is we have factories. We essentially make like a config file, and we can define the jobs at runtime. So we have a code that essentially in an ad hoc way. So you could make like assets that could be ordered and assembled in any way, basically at runtime, which is pretty cool. It makes it so you don't have to know the dependencies, or you don't have to change the code. You can essentially build your jobs through configuration, which I think
Mhm.
is pretty useful. Um, so let's go to yeah. So here's my job to create the report, um, and we'll materialize. They call it materialize. Oh, what happened here? I think it gonna restart this server. Maybe something happened. Okay.
Do you find that getting started with Dagster is easier than Airflow or harder?
Well, it's hard because from my memory, Airflow was pretty difficult, but I feel like if I hadn't done Airflow, maybe Dagster would have been even harder.
Hmm.
Um, so it's hard to say. I mean, so look, in retrospect, Dagster seems pretty easy, but I, basically what I went through is what it is. I would recommend if you're interested, they have this thing called Dagster University. It's like a pretty nice project tutorial that I went through, and I think that that's really helpful.
Cool.
But there is a lot of stuff in there, and there's a lot of flexibility, which can make it harder. So this is really the heart of it. Is the coolest part is just sort of the UI and all the things it gives you visibility to when it's running. I mean, Airflow has this stuff, but it's like it's just not as nice as the way that Dagster does it. Um, so like, one thing I haven't talked about is that everything is logged, right? So
Mhm.
um, you can kind of see like, well, I just restarted the server, so only the thing I'm running now is shown, but like you can have sort of the default is to have a SQLite database store everything, but we have at work like a Postgres server running that will store the runs. And so, essentially all the information for your runs is going to be stored in all the logs. So everything
Right.
it's doing here is like logging to some database somewhere. And I do things like, and for some reason this is not, I'm not sure what's going on. It usually takes like 10 seconds. So I'll have to, of course, it's like Murphy's Law. Um, but the cool thing about it is like I log like the queries that are constructed on the fly, so you can see like, did it actually do make the right query? The metadata, like you can view the metadata in here that you had. So it's super useful. Um, I don't know why this one's not running. It's odd. Hmm, what happened? Oh, failed. Oh, I know why. Because I had to quit duck. So that's one of the concurrency issues coming up. Let me see if I could just rerun it here. Okay. So green, it worked. So you could see like, you know, yeah. So let's go back here. So yeah, essentially it has um, like this is part of the metadata. It's just showing like whatever was created
Mhm.
for that report, and then out here you have the final report. Um, I think one of the things before we run out of time, yeah. So I'm not going to run this right now, but you could see like something like Stage Daily Scoreboard has these partitions.
Mhm.
And so here's where you can choose like what to run. Like, you could like usually you're just gonna be running the latest date, but if something fails, you could go back and backfill, and it's super easy. That was all to me. That was always a pain in Airflow. It was like kind of the I don't know, the UI or whatever. Like doing stuff like this was a little bit annoying. Here, it's pretty easy to do backfills. So and then I don't have any asset checks defined here, but if I did, they would show up on this tab, and you can. It does cool things like it'll plot like a history of your asset checks. So let's say like an asset check might be like, um, or metadata too. Like your metadata might be like how many players were inserted into a table, and you could plot that by day. So things like that. It makes super easy. Um, yeah, I think that's it. I think we're gonna run out of time in like a minute. So if you guys have questions,
This was really interesting. I
yeah,
am, if nothing else, I really like the way Dagster's UI looks. So that's way better than Airflow.
yeah. It's definitely better than Airflow from the UI perspective. Yeah.
No, this was
Uh,
this was very cool. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this
yeah,
is
and
neat.
if you have questions, obviously just Slack me.
Yeah, no, this is great. I'm sure I might have some Dagster ones. So I think I'm going to try and figure out first start local and then see if I can.
Yeah,
And the
Uh,
repo is open, right?
yeah.